All right, fam. So I just want to show you how to push these projects to GitHub in the most simple of ways. And really, is realistically, whenever you're working on a project, it'll always come up that you want to get something onto GitHub. So typically, here's what I do to start. Like, let's say I have a folder on my computer called projects, right? And inside of that folder is where I save all of my projects. So maybe I built a new React app and I added it here as a project, right? Maybe I create another project called, project 2 or something, right? And then inside of this folder, I have a bunch of projects, right? Eventually, I'll have a bunch of projects saved here. If you're not somebody that uses the terminal, you could be creating these projects in like VS Code, for instance, right? So like, if I were to if I wanted to do something like, hey, I'm not really comfortable using the terminal, but I know I'm going to be creating projects, right? Like we've talked about, you can always create a new project in VS Code, also, right? So I typically like to structure my projects in folders because it's just easy to organize, right?
Yes.
The shortcut way that I like to do this in VS Code is like open the folder and save the folder, like save that folder in that same place. So like, okay, I have my projects folder, right? So now inside of here, if I was doing this all VS Code, I could create a new folder in here and call it like project 3 or something, right? And then opening project 3, now I have a new project in VS Code. Now I can add all the files, etc. Right? So whether you use the terminal or you use VS Code to start projects, the biggest thing is you want to keep everything organized in separate folders. That's one of the most important things, because not only will it keep you organized, have the files in the right place, it's very helpful for when you're using Git and GitHub to have each project in its own folder. And I'll show you why in a second. So let's say, for the sake of just this example, that this project 3, is the project I actually want to push to GitHub, right? In this project, right? Like I mentioned, we need to have a folder for it, right? So in this case, project 3 might be a simple, let's say it's a simple kind of regular like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript project, right? So that just means that I have 3 files that I'm gonna expect to see in there. Maybe like an index.html file, my index.javascript file, and my styles.css file, right? So
Yes.
This could be anything. This could be a Python project and I got Python files. This could be a Java project, I got Java files, right? The point is that inside of my project folder, I have the project files that I'm working on, right? So the thing is that every time I start a new project and I know that I want to keep a record of that project over time, it is a good idea to add Git to that project folder, right? That's why I said it's very important to order and organize your work in folders, because we can add Git to specific folders to look at all of the project files that we have inside of it and keep track of those files as they're changing across the project. So right now, I just created 3 files and there's nothing inside of them yet, but hey, the fact that I created them is a big deal, because now I have 3 files in my project that I might want to keep track of. So when it comes to using Git and GitHub, you have to understand that first, you need to have Git installed inside of a folder. That's like the first big thing, right? So we have this folder, we have the files. Step 1 is great. The next thing you need to do is you need to initialize Git in the project folder where your files are. If you're on a Mac, it's pretty simple. Or if you're on a Mac or a Linux computer, it's pretty simple. You can just use the terminal or the VS Code terminal. If you're on a Windows machine, you have to use the Git bash that gets installed when you install Git on your machine, right? So if you don't have Git on your machine, you have to download Git. It's a free download. You go to this website, git-scm.com, to install it. It will tell you based on your operating system, give you the download. For Mac, it's pretty straightforward. It installs in the terminal. For Windows, it installs a separate application that you have to use that's called the Git bash. And once you have Git installed on your machine, Now you can add it to your project files like we're seeing here, right? So what I like to do is I like to, on my computer, because I'm using a Mac, open the project in my terminal, right? And it's the same thing if you're doing this on your Git bash or on Windows. You need to open this particular project file in the terminal, in some terminal, right? So I'll show you two terminals that you can use, right? The first one would be the easiest one that you can use would technically be the VS Code terminal, right? Because if you opened a project folder, a specific project folder, right? It can't be a folder with the project folder inside of it. It should be the project folder, right? That terminal in VS Code will open directly to that project folder like you see here. And now I can really easily initialize Git just from like 2 clicks, right? I can do it right here. Let's say I'm on a Windows machine, or I, for whatever reason, I don't have access to something like this, right? On the terminal, because like on a Windows machine, the Git commands don't actually just work in the terminal. If I was using my Git bash or a separate application, right? What I would need to do is open that separate application that is my terminal, right? So let me just do it from scratch so you see. So on a Mac, the separate application we can use is for our command line interface is the terminal app, right? You can open that in your Mac by holding command and pressing the space bar and just typing terminal, and that will pull up the terminal app, and you could just press enter and it will open up this same application that you see on my screen. If you're on a Windows machine, the app that you want to use in this case would be the Git bash, because we're going to be using Git commands in this application. If you opened the command prompt, which is the Windows equivalent to the terminal, you also would have an issue using the Git because of the fact that it didn't initialize that command in a specific way for Windows. So if you're on Windows, you're using the Git bash. If you're on Mac, you're using the terminal. But in either case, the thing you need to do is the same. Just like we did before, right? We have to open that particular project folder in our in that application, right? The VS Code terminal makes it super easy. That's why I like to open folders in VS Code, because once I click terminal, it takes me immediately to that folder, right? What we need to do is find the path to that folder where our code files are structured, right? So one way to do this very easily would be to use the pwd command, which will give us the path to that folder in that we're trying to access. We can do this. Another way is on Windows, you can copy the path name by right-clicking on your project folder and saying, hey, what's this copy as path name, or copy as file path, something like this. On Mac, you can also just kind of drag that project folder into the terminal. I'll show you like this. Whoops, y'all seeing all my glory. Right, so if I have project 3, right, I could do something like, drag this into the terminal, and I'll get that same path name that is the same thing here, right? Either way, I want to be able to go into that same folder, right? And once I'm inside of the folder, no matter which of these ways I did it, the first thing I got to do inside of it, once I know I'm inside of the project folder, if I look inside of that folder, I see my files, right? If I look inside of this folder in VS Code, I see my files, right? The next thing I want to do is initialize Git in that folder, right? So to initialize Git, you have to install Git, but the next thing you need to do is git init. And git init is going to create a new Git repository in your folder. In that folder, right? That's like, I keep saying the step 1, but this is the most important thing for Git that we've talked about so far, right? We made our project, we have our files. Now we initialize a repo in that project folder. So that project folder has Git inside of it. That's really all we want to achieve, is each project folder that we work on, each project we work on, right, should have its own Git repository inside of it. That's why you want to have it structured again, where each project has its own folder, because you only want to initialize Git one time inside of a particular folder. So that is that's the most important thing so far with the Git, is having each project folder having a Git repository inside of it. Once you have a Git repository inside of your project folder, now all it is about saving your code at different moments when you want to keep a record of the code. And the way you do that is by creating what we call commits, right? So let's say in this JavaScript file, I'll just do some simple JavaScript, just say like hello world, right? I could be building a whole application in this, but either way we'll see, right? Save this, right? I'm starting to just work on the project as if I were building something specific, right? So maybe inside of this CSS, maybe I'm gonna have a class in here called main, let's say main message, right? And this is gonna have just, you know, some CSS in here, something, right? Then in my HTML, right, you know, this is just meant to just kind of demonstrate the this is meant to kind of just demonstrate like what we're doing, right? So if I had a simple HTML file, just kind of giving myself some code here, right? And then I have like this, and I say, right? So now I have this, all three of my files have code in it, right? Like I said, this could be Python code, this could be Java code, this could be whatever, right? All my files have code in them. Now that we've initialized Git inside of that folder, right? If I run the command git status, I'll see that all three of those files are now being watched by Git. Like Git is looking inside of this project folder at all of the files. So every time I make a change to one of these files, right, it's gonna keep a record of all the changes and which files got changed, right? So Git is smart to see which files are being changed at any given point in time. And if you want to check which files have been changed at any given point in time, you just do the git status, right, to see which files have been changed. All that you need to do in order to save those changes are 3 steps in Git. The first is to add the files you want to keep a record of in that save, right? So I can either say, hey, add each file directly, like just, hey, add index.html, right? And doing that then will show you that the index.html now is being watched by Git, right? I can also then say, okay, hey, you know, add index.js, right? And then again, if I do git status, okay, both those are being watched. But what if you have 20 files, right? Sometimes you don't want to have to type them all one by one. So we use a shortcut called git add dot, which will add all of the files inside of the folder that have been updated, right? Really, any file that has changes to be committed, right? So git add dot will then add all of the files, right? So shortcut, we just use git add to add all of our files. Whether you're adding one file or all of them is up to you based on your circumstances. But first thing we got to do is add the files, right? The next thing we got to do is commit the files. We got to create a message that's saying, hey, this is what I'm saving, right? So here I might say initial website files or something, right? These are my 3 files for my website. Hey, these are my initial files, right? That commit is it on Git side. I've done everything I need to do. Now I've saved the version of the code with this particular setup at this particular moment, right? Again, if ever I come back here and I say, I make a change, right? Like, let's say I add some more HTML, right? And I do git status, I'll see that this file has been changed. Oh, okay, this file's been changed. So in order to do something now to keep a record of this change, I need to do the same thing. I need to add the change. because this is one file, I could just say index.html, right? But like I showed you, I just like to use the shortcut to add all of the changed files. After adding all of the changed files, again, we just have to make a commit to say adding paragraph to my HTML, right? Whatever is a helpful message to remember what am I doing at this point in time, right? That's all you do with Git. You start your project folder, start your files, and then you add Git inside of the project folder so that as you're making changes inside of this project folder, it can keep a record of all the changes. It keeps a record of all the changes based on you adding files and committing those files so that you can keep them as a record of like, what are the different changes that I've made in the project. If you ever want to look at all the changes somebody's made in a project that's using Git, you can run the command git log and you'll see all of the different commits that somebody's made in that particular project, right? That's it on the Git side. That's all you need to do to your inside of your project folder with Git on your computer. The next step is always people are curious about is how do I get this onto GitHub then?
Yeah,
Right?
that's what I was wondering, because like
I
all the
got you,
steps
bro. I got you. I got
all
you,
the
bro.
steps that you were doing, I saw you did it before in like the recorded lectures. So I have been doing that. It's just the, going putting it to GitHub. Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Don't worry, bro. I got you, bro. I mean, it's like get to the GitHub. I got you.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's what I.
So the thing you need to do, right, is GitHub always comes like GitHub is a separate thing than Git, right? You adding your commits on Git is great because now you have a record of that. But now if you want to add this to GitHub, you need to create a new repository on GitHub, right? That's going to basically hold those same changes on GitHub, right? So with GitHub, you need to create a secondary repository that's going to hold your code. Typically, we name that repository the same name as our local project, but there's some cases where people don't do that, but most times we name the repository on GitHub the same name as our project locally. So my project locally was called Project 3. I would name it the same thing here, right? You don't really need to do anything else on GitHub but create this repository, right? So once I give it a name, I'm just going to create a new repository, right? All of these steps that you see here on GitHub side are meant to help you connect your GitHub to your local project that we just started. So think about it like we already have a local project. It has some files in it. We want to push those files to GitHub. In order to make that happen, we need to connect our local project to GitHub so it knows it knows about the GitHub repo that we're about to create. So that's what most of these commands are doing. GitHub is there's a couple ways you can start projects in GitHub, right? One way is like you don't have any files, you don't have any folders, but you just are creating you're just trying to set up a project with GitHub easily. This first thing that it talks about is create a new repository on a command line. This is what it's talking about. I don't typically follow this because it's very rare that these steps are going to actually make sense for my project. What we've done is we've created a project locally on our computer that has an existing Git repository from the command line. We already made a project with a Git repository. When we started the project, we did Git init. We did all of those things locally on our project, right? If you look at some of the instructions here, it's doing some of what we just did, but it is doing it in a way that personally I find a little weird in terms of how they describe this. But as you can see, they initialize the Git repo, right? They add some files, right? They commit, and that's it. But this doesn't make sense because this has nothing to do with our project at all, right? What we've done is we've made those commits locally on Git, and now we just need to connect it to GitHub. So typically what I like to do is follow these steps. So all you need to do is create a connection between your local repository and your GitHub repository. That's what this command is doing. It's creating a connection between our local repository and this GitHub repository. So I'm just gonna copy this command and back in the terminal, right? Inside of my project folder where the Git is clearly connected, I'm gonna run this command, right? This command is going to add that link to GitHub, and it's going to call that link origin. That's what this is doing. It's creating a link to our GitHub repo into our local repository so that we can refer to GitHub as this thing called origin, right? The next command basically just changes the name of our branch on our local repository to be called main. So this is just GitHub recommends we do this just so that there's consistent naming conventions across our local project and the GitHub project. So this command just changes the name of our branch. As you can see, it went from being called master to being called main. Not too much to talk about there without getting into some more complicated stuff, but that's what that command does. The next command is the command that is about GitHub, which is pushing. We push Git repositories from one, we can push Git code from one repository to another. And that's what this command is doing, is pushing our code from our local computer to GitHub. So running this command is going to say, hey, take all of the commits I've made locally and push them to this remote repository called origin, right? Remember I said that we made a link to the GitHub, it was called origin. So we're saying push all of my local commits to that GitHub repository, right? And when I run this, it's gonna take all of the commits that we just made, and when I refresh, all of those commits are gonna be there. So I've made 2 commits so far on this project locally, right? And now I've pushed them to GitHub. If ever I wanna make some more changes, right, the steps are the same. So now I go back to my local project and I'm like, okay, cool. You know, maybe I want to change this, give it a different, give it some more CSS, right? Make the font size, 40 pixels or something ridiculous, right? So now I made a change, right? Again, whenever I make a change in a project that's using Git, it will always show me that something's been modified. I need to add that file to be changed, or to be saved, excuse me. So after I've made my changes, right, I want to add all of my files that have been changed. I want to commit them locally and give it some message to say, changing the styling, or whatever message refers to what you just did in the code. And now that I've added and committed them, right, like we talked about, that is all I do locally on Git. But after making that connection, right, now that I've made that connection to GitHub, now I made that connection to GitHub with that command, git remote add origin. Now I can add one more step to my workflow. I add the files that I made changes to, I commit them. And now if I really want to push those changes to GitHub, I can push them to GitHub as well with this command, git push -u. Origin is typically whatever we named our repository link, right? Typically we name it origin when we run this command, right? So origin would be the name of the thing in GitHub, and then main refers to the branch that we were going to push to in GitHub. Again, getting into branches is a little bit more advanced for what I'm trying to demonstrate here. But if you follow the steps in GitHub, your branch is called main. So you want to run this command to then push all the changes you just made to GitHub again. And if we refresh, we should see another commit here inside of our repository. And that's it, we continuously do that workflow over and over again. Add changes in our project, like we just make some different files, write different code in each file. Once we're ready, we can, we see those changes need to be saved in Git. We can add them, commit them. And then once we've established a connection between GitHub and our local project, we push them to GitHub to have them reflected here on GitHub. And that's literally all that you need to do for your workflow. The only thing that I didn't mention that you have to do in order to establish the connection to GitHub is to make sure you authenticate with GitHub. And there's 2 ways you can do that. One way is using HTTPS tokens. The other way is to connect by creating an SSH key. And GitHub, I'll put some links that walk through those documentations in the description, or in the Slack if you're following this on the Slack. But either way, once you've made that authentication with GitHub, so it knows your profile, knows who you are, etc. Everything I just showed you is the workflow for adding, committing, and pushing the files to GitHub. And we do it over and over again. All you got to remember is keep your projects organized in folders, because by keeping your project organized in a folder, right, all of those files will be easily added to GitHub as individual files inside of that folder, right? So you always want to keep your projects organized in folders, and you want to create that folder so that you can open it easily in your text editor or find it easily in your third-party terminal or whatever app you're using to make these changes. As you work on your project and make different changes to your code base, at certain moments when you want to save it, you can just use the git commands to add the changes, commit the change, and that will keep a record of the change for you on your machine. When you're ready, you can push those changes to GitHub. You don't always have to push to GitHub. It's just something that typically we do in specific moments. So it's helpful to know what you need to do if you want to push to GitHub. So hopefully this is helpful in breaking the process down for you, Finn.
Definitely.